Even our national newspaper didn't have a dedicated environment reporter. And so we saw this huge void, and we just stepped into it with the Narwhal. We really wanted to create a brand that was beautiful, that drew people into our shared love of the natural world. That's something that people in Canada are almost universally proud of. It's why most people live here. It's why many people around the world want to live here and come here, is, because of our lakes, our rivers, our mountains. Any Canadian tourism ad, people are canoeing or they're skating on a lake or they're hiking. And so we really wanted to tap into that shared value, because environmental issues can be so polarizing. And it's just so interesting that this thing that we universally love and claim as sort of a Canadian identity is also one of the things that divides us the most.
Welcome to the Mo'unga Bay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is Emma Gilchrist, co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Canadian news nonprofit, The Narwhal. Founded in 2018 with journalist Carol Linnett, The Narwhal is on the forefront of investigations and news in some of Canada's most vital environmental stories. Gilchrist speaks with co-host Rachel Donald about the grassroots success of her news organization, which has grown to a staff of 26, the stories they highlight, and their current legal battles, which could have significant implications for press freedom in Canada. In 2021, journalist Amber Bracken was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police while on assignment for the Narwhal, covering the activist opposition to the Wet'suwet'en pipeline in British Columbia. Despite the fact that she was clearly identified as press and had notified the police of her presence beforehand, she was detained for 3 full days before being released. Gilchrist also shares the priority of centering Indigenous voices and reporters in the leadership and the stories they publish, and why newsrooms that more concretely and directly invest in environmental reporting are needed at this moment.
Emma, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure, always such a pleasure to speak with other independent eco-journalists, essentially, especially when it's, as we were sort of saying before we started recording, especially when it's young women who have sort of come to really define this industry and its evolution. So please tell us, what is the Narwhal and how did it come about?
Yeah, so the Narwhal is an nonprofit online magazine in Canada that covers the natural world in Canada. So we focus on in-depth and investigative journalism about the environment. We really work to center Indigenous voices and stories, given that they're the landholders and title holders in much of Canada. And, we really try not to chase the same kinds of stories that everybody else is chasing. So we try to tell the stories that nobody else can. And we came about, we're about 6 years old now. We were founded by myself and my colleague, Carol Linnett. We were 33 at the time, and we just saw a huge gap in the Canadian media landscape for in-depth and investigative journalism on the environment. And at that time, you could count the number of environment reporters in Canada on one hand. There was just this huge void. I had started out as an environment reporter at a newspaper. And at that time, almost every regional newspaper had an environment reporter in kind of the mid-2000s. But over the next 10 years, I saw almost all of those positions eliminated. Even our national newspaper didn't have a dedicated environment reporter. And so we saw this huge void, and we just stepped into it with the Narwhal. We really wanted to create a brand that was beautiful, that drew people into our shared love of the natural world. That's something that people in Canada are almost universally proud of. It's why most people live here. It's why many people around the world want to live here and come here. Is, because of our lakes, our rivers, our mountains. Any Canadian tourism ad, people are canoeing or they're skating on a lake or they're hiking. And so we really wanted to tap into that shared value, because environmental issues can be so polarizing. And it's just so interesting that this thing that we universally love and claim as sort of a Canadian identity is also one of the things that divides us the most. So part of our mission at the Narwhal is to really harness the power of journalism to bridge divides and to bring people together around these stories that we really have a shared interest, in the continued health of our world, our planet.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I want to get into the media landscape of Canada, but just to pick up on something you said at the end there, and maybe you can tease out some of the Canadian psychology for us. Why is it that if this love for nature and the wild world is universal, how is it that there is this political divide even in Canada when it comes to how we treat and think of the natural world? Like, if there is love on both sides, what happens?
Well, it's kind of this real paradox where Canada is home to some of the last savable, intact, large landscapes on the planet. Some of the last, large savable tracts of rainforest. Many people don't think of Canada as being home to rainforest, but we are home to temperate coastal rainforest here, boreal forest, wetlands. Canada stores a tremendous amount of the world's carbon in our landscapes. We're home to all of these landscapes. We're also home to tremendous amounts of oil, gas, minerals, and wood. And a lot of the history of Canada since colonialism has been chopping things down and digging things up and shipping it out. And so you have a real collision of that sort of grand natural wealth that we have and some of the key economic drivers. And of course, you can't ignore that the oil and gas industry and other industries are tremendously influential over every facet of the Canadian economy and politics. They're very intertwined with our banking system, with, just every facet of society. In some places in Canada, they're literally involved in building curriculum in schools. So there's this real kind of problematic intertwining of corporate interests and the public interests. And I think sometimes the best interests of Canadians gets lost in the mix of that. And so, that's really the inherent tension that we're living in Canada. And also, I should say, it's not like the answers to this are easy. These are really challenging, complex problems, and transitioning an economy is a really hard thing. So I think it's pretty natural as well that we have some pretty divisive conversations on these topics.
Yeah, well said. There is no magic bullet, silver bullet for anything that we're sort of looking to achieve in the next century. Although it is frustrating to be forced into quite circular conversations around nonsensical solutions like carbon capture in a decade in which we are absolutely running out of time and we need to be confronting the complexity of what it is that we're facing.
Carbon capture technology is a form of carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and is notably criticized by established climate scientists such as David T. Ho, who emphasizes that CDR is not a climate solution that replaces radical and immediate emission cuts. He says that immediate and rapid decarbonization, first and foremost across every sector that can achieve it, is necessary before carbon dioxide removal begins to be effective. You can read his thoughts on this published in the journal Nature under Carbon Dioxide Removal is an Ineffective Time Machine.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's, in Canada, we have this great kind of dichotomy, right, of a lot of people really valuing the natural world and being very concerned about the climate crisis and the environmental justice implications of all of it. And at the same time, we're still building new fossil fuel export pipelines in Canada. And in fact, the Canadian government bought a oil export pipeline and took it over from a private company. And that's about to come into service very soon. And that's to export bitumen from the oil sands, which is one of the dirtiest sources of oil in the world. So, we really kind of have the pinnacle of environmental issues here. We have the world's second largest deposits of oil. We have these tremendous forests.
Important to note that many countries rank their oil reserves based on what is proven or recoverable with present-day technology and economic conditions. These estimates can vary depending on the source. The Canadian government's website lists the nation as having the third largest proven reserves as of the end of 2014. most of them in Alberta's oil sands, but they note here that there could be even more reserves with the advancement of technology. Other sources list Canada as having the fourth largest proven reserves.
We are building new liquefied natural gas export facilities in British Columbia. And a lot of it, these issues, they come, to bear all over the country, but British Columbia, where we founded the Narwhal, is a real hotbed. It's the birthplace of the modern environmental movement, in part, the birthplace of Greenpeace, at least, and just known for being so beautiful, so stunning. Most of British Columbia is unceded Indigenous land, and some really groundbreaking title cases have been fought here. And so the landscape is just incredibly complex, and we have every kind of issue, from mining, logging, liquefied natural gas export pipelines, oil pipelines, plus these tremendous places to save. And one of the really exciting things that we've seen recently is Indigenous peoples just stepping up and saying, we're protecting this place, with or without the buy-in of the federal or provincial governments. And so there's been a real rush of Indigenous protected areas happening here right across the country. And I think that's been really interesting and exciting for us to report on.
I'm glad you've brought this up, because it was something that really stood out to me when I was researching the Narwhal. Just how much you uplift Indigenous voices, collaborate with Indigenous peoples. And you've also just launched a photojournalism fellowship, I believe, for Indigenous people. So how was it that you came to that decision to align the Narwhal so closely with the Indigenous struggle in Canada?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, it never even really felt like a decision. Right from the beginning, when we launched the Narwhal, 2 of our board members were incredible Indigenous journalists. And so they certainly helped shape that vision and hold us accountable to making sure that the storytellers on our team are at least in part Indigenous themselves, and that we aren't story taking. And so that's been really built into the DNA of the Narwhal from the beginning. There's always more work to do, but it's just fundamental. And I think it's also one of the things that, we are looking at the gaps to fill, right? And it's one of the things that the Canadian media was really overlooking, doing a poor job of not representing accurately the rights of Indigenous peoples on these lands. And so, we cut our teeth on a lot of those stories. There's literally an Indigenous nation within British Columbia that fought a 25-year court battle to win title to its land, and it's like a country within a country. It's its own nation, right? And they have unextinguished title to those lands for millennia, and they're the first to win that title. But those issues are at play all across British Columbia. So you really can't tell any environmental story in this country without having Indigenous voices and talking about the Indigenous title issues at play. And on top of that, of course, it's an environmental justice issue too, because many of these places that are a little bit out of sight, out of mind for many people, say the oil sands extraction, are happening in areas where a lot of Indigenous people live and are directly impacted by this resource extraction in sometimes, really serious ways in terms of health concerns and pollution.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I love that storytelling versus story taking. And I feel like this is something that's finally sort of percolating up into journalism. It's been in the academy for some time, especially sort of, postmodernism. But now, how is it that we center the people who are experiencing stories while we're telling their stories, or allowing them first, to tell their own stories whenever possible? And I think it's absolutely critical when providing the diversity of perspective that we need to understand what's going on and what decisions that we can take. Because this is the thing, right? It opens up a myriad of possibilities and different ways of thinking. The fact that an Indigenous people have won their nation, the title to their own land for millennia, that is such a hopeful piece of news that we need to hear more of, because then it tells people on the other side of Canada, well, that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the most interesting and inspiring work on the environment in Canada right now is definitely by Indigenous nations.
Tell me a little bit about the state of mainstream media in Canada. You said that when you started that you could count the number of environmental journalists on one hand, but perhaps more broadly, how is it that they generally treat these environmental stories? And I mean, we can not to point fingers, although we can if you want. Would you say that the media has been complicit at all as well in this sort of advancing ecological crisis?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So it's changed a lot over the last 6 years, to be honest. There's been a huge sea change in the amount of environmental coverage in the more legacy outlets, everyone from the CBC to the Globe and Mail to the Weather Network. And so it's definitely improved and continues to improve. And yet I think it's sort of inevitable that these legacy institutions are somewhat complicit in the environmental crisis because they have a tremendous status quo bias, right? For instance, I often say the Narwhal is like the environment section of the newspaper. And then people kind of think for a second and I say, except for there isn't one of those. None of our newspapers have an environment section. All of our newspapers have a business section. And most of the environment stories in Canada in traditional media are told in the business section. So they're told centering a certain set of concerns. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think what the Narwhal does is flip that on its head a little bit. And we center a different set of concerns, right? So we center climate science, Indigenous perspectives, the health of the planet, et cetera. And some people, they look at that and they, might have the initial reaction that's, some people use the phrase advocacy journalism. And I always say, that's no more advocacy journalism than the business section telling stories through the voices of businessmen, but that's so ingrained in our expectations of what we expect in the newspaper that we don't even see it. So I think it's that at a base level, it's just that status quo bias of doing what we've always done. And of course, the fossil fuel industry does have tremendous power in this country too. They buy a lot of advertising. They're involved in every level of society. And that's not to demonize them in any way, but other voices in our society, like voices raising environmental concerns, they don't have the same kind of sway either in the media landscape or on the political level in terms of ability to lobby and build laws and run massive multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns. So it's not an even playing field. And one of the things that I've been most excited to see happen at the Narwhal over the last 6 years is that we've actually been able to partner with many of these traditional news outlets. So we partner with the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's largest, kind of most prominent daily newspaper. We've done an investigation with them on mining. We just recently published a front page story with them on endangered Roosevelt elk on Vancouver Island. We've partnered with the Weather Network, which is seen by millions of Canadians. We share a reporter with the Winnipeg Free Press, who's literally shared between our newsrooms, and all of her work is published in both outlets. We've partnered with CTV, which is one of Canada's, big national TV networks. And these partnerships are super important because what we've always wanted to do with the Narwhal is bring environmental news to the mainstream. We never wanted to be on the margins. We never wanted to be, and, I always say, there's nothing that makes the Narwhal an alternative news source. Just because we're operating on the internet, there's something alternative about that in 2024. We just have a new model, right? But we very much want to mainstream environmental news. And because we've seen time and time again that this is news that all Canadians need and want and are interested in. And it doesn't need to exist off in the margins, and it doesn't serve anybody for it to exist there.
I mean, the fact that you've grown your team from the two of you that founded it to 22 at last count in 6 years?
26 now. It just grew again. 26. So yeah, 26.
I mean, that is a feat in itself, especially when what we're seeing all around the Western world are journalism layoffs. It's not looking good for journalists out there. And yet these independent environmental outlets are growing. And I think that speaks to the fact that you're covering the stories that A, nobody else is, and B, that the public really, really want to know about.
Yeah, it never ceases to astonish me how many people support us. So we don't run any advertising on the Narwhal, and we don't have a paywall. So nobody has to give us money, but over 7,000 people do give us money. And that's our single largest source of revenue. And it's just amazing that people, the work, I think, for them, it gives people a way to be involved in meaningful change. Because some of our reporting has literally helped to change policy. It's resulted in areas like the Greenbelt around Toronto, for instance, being saved from development, contributed to that along with many other factors. It's very hard to ever say this single piece of journalism did, this, but we get so many messages from people saying that the Narwhal has helped restore their faith in media and democracy. And it's just such a beautiful, virtuous cycle where they support us. That allows us to do more of that kind of journalism, holding power to account and inspiring and giving people the tools they need to hold power to account, right? Giving them the information that they need. And then that, results in more support. So this is a very beautiful thing. And I think it just so powerful, this new model for reader-funded journalism.
And nonprofit as well, I think we should flag. Why that decision?
Yeah, we did consider going the for-profit route, but at that moment, I looked around the Canadian news landscape and I saw a lot of other indie news outlets. Most of them had been founded as for-profits because there wasn't really any benefit to being a nonprofit news organization in Canada at that time. It's since changed. But what I kind of witnessed was that most of those for-profit institutions were operating essentially like nonprofits anyways. Nobody was, making any money for shareholders. Everybody was struggling to survive. And so we thought, why don't we just keep our story and philosophy really clean and have no advertising, no shareholders, go with the nonprofit model. And we were also looking south of the border to the US, to the Institute for Nonprofit News, which has, I believe, over 400 members. And we were kind of reading the tea leaves and hoping and praying that some changes were going to happen in Canada, but to pave the way for nonprofit news in Canada. And lo and behold, they did. And the federal government introduced a new tax status that allows us to issue tax receipts. And the Narwhal ended up becoming the first organization to get that status because we had kind of made that gamble on being a nonprofit. And so we were really well positioned to literally the day they opened the applications for that new status, we were like, we've got it. And I mean, that's been amazing. That's opened up foundation funding for us. It allows us to issue tax receipts for all donations. And that is definitely part of the explosive growth. Like, I think if you'd asked us 5 or 6 years ago, if we thought we were going to be 26 staff now, we would have been like, no way. And yet, we always say it's like the horse kind of bolted from the barn, and we've been kind of dragging behind ever since, trying to get back on it.
Well, I have to say, it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like an incredibly well thought out, considered, beautifully designed as well. For anybody listening, please, you have to go and just look at it even. It's such a sort of like visual beauty as well, your stories. And just truly exquisite reporting on stories that obviously are like vastly undercovered. So yeah, hats off to you. What a feat. Well done.
Thank you so much. We really wanted, we set out to make a really beautiful website because we're covering, these beautiful places and beautiful people. And so we've always put an emphasis on the visual storytelling. And often we're telling stories about places that are out of sight, out of mind, and places that very few people will ever see with their own two eyes. So we want to be able to take them there. And the beauty of not having any advertising on our website is what allows us to make the site really beautiful, right? Yeah. To have full width images and to not have to kind of, muss it up with, ads in the margins and stuff like that. So it really allowed like a clarity of vision, I think, around what we wanted to do by just going the nonprofit model and not messing around with ads.
And as you say, it facilitates a moral clarity, which then makes it much easier for people to just jump on that bandwagon and support you. As part of that moral clarity, you have a legal case going on defending the freedom of the press in Canada. Could you tell us what happened to Amber Bracken?
Yeah. So back in November 2021, Amber Bracken, who's a award-winning photographer, she shoots for, all sorts of outlets like the New York Times, for instance. She was out on assignment for us in Wet'suwet'en territory, which is an area in northwestern British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. And she had been covering ongoing conflict over the construction of a liquefied natural gas pipeline there for years. And in this instance, police moved in to make arrests in the location where she needed to be doing her reporting. And despite her clearly identifying herself as a member of the press, despite us letting the police know in advance that she was there, they went ahead and arrested her anyways. And they actually detained her for 3 full days.
Shocking.
And then, about a month later, they dropped the charges against her, but they had charged her for breaking an injunction and being in that location. There's been an ongoing controversy over this in Canada, this idea that the National Police Force is trying to keep journalists out of places where they have injunctions. But previous legal rulings have shown that journalists are allowed to be there and in fact need to be there. And they especially need to be there in cases of Indigenous rights when mass militarized arrests are happening. There need to be independent observers there. And so, she was there. She got arrested. She got put in jail. The charges were dropped. But we decided that we really had no choice but to sue the National Police Force over this because they've been making a pattern of this conduct. They've been getting away with it. They've been blocking access for journalists. And nobody has really taken them to task for that. And thanks to our readers, we knew that people would support this case. They came out in droves to support Amber when she was arrested, to support her legal fees and just like getting her out of jail and navigating all of that. And they've come forward in droves to support us suing the RCMP as well. So, we're hoping to be in court this fall. The case is expected to take up to 5 years. It's a massive undertaking for, what is still quite a small organization. But it's so fundamental to Canadians' right to know, Canadians' right to information, and also Indigenous rights, honestly, that because most of these issues with journalistic access to areas where arrests are happening are on Indigenous lands and they're of Indigenous peoples. And this just can't be allowed to continue happening. So we're hoping to set a precedent with this case. And there's various outcomes that could happen, right up to actually changing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada to specifically name press freedom. So it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes. But we didn't really want to take the case, but we really felt like we had to because our rights and Amber's rights had just been so flagrantly abused. And we were in the position to do something about it. So we had to.
Good for you. Out of curiosity, do you have any support from the mainstream press in this? I assume your partners.
We do. We did hear from a lot of folks supporting us right out of the gates. Because of the nature of this case, it's not, I'm trying to think of the right legal speak for this, but because it's like we're suing the RCMP, to be named in the case, you need to have actually had your rights infringed upon that day in this particular instance. So it's not a case that like everybody can just sign on to, but folks may be able to come in as interveners. And we have had the support of the Canadian Association of Journalists who've been issuing press releases and supporting this case. So there's definitely widespread support for this case in the media landscape. And it's just kind of an unfortunate legal reality that we kind of mostly need to go it alone because it was our journalist whose rights were contravened on that day. And you need to take a specific case to prove the legal point.
Well, I will be following it closely for however long it takes and wish you all the best with it. Just while I've got you here as an environmental and political journalist, what's the political landscape looking in Canada at the moment with regards to, your future governments and how they will impact these next crucial years when it comes to fighting the climate crisis and fighting for the rights of nature?
Yeah, it's looking really complicated right now, really uncertain. We have a federal election coming up in about a year and a half in Canada, unless it comes sooner. You never know. Sometimes the snap election can be called, and there is a minority government right now. But right now, these last kind of few weeks, there's been tremendous backlash and debate about the carbon tax, which has been in place for 5 years, and that's under assault again. The Conservative Party is leading in the polls, and they have made a lot of promises to wipe out some good environmental policies. So a lot of things are at risk in terms of Canada's environmental policies right now, depending on how this next year and a half goes and what way that goes. And then, of course, the provinces have a tremendous amount of influence and sway as well. And all of those elections happen at different times, but we have an election coming up in British Columbia within the next 6 months as well. And it's uncertain of how that'll go as well. So yeah, I'd say there's a lot of uncertainty, and sort of the Conservatives have really been able to create a wedge issue around the carbon tax right now due to it's like the soaring cost of living, right? There's I think most places in the world right now, there's real, inflationary and cost of living challenges. And when the carbon tax is going up, it's pretty ripe, fuel for the fire if you want to campaign against those types of policies. So that's become very complicated. And yeah, we have, a few quite regressive provincial governments in place in terms of environmental policies. So it's a super mixed bag right now.
And what about the rise of authoritarianism, or even in some cases, I would go so far as to say fascism south of the border in the United States? Do you think that serves as a warning to Canadians, or is that catching on in a way that a wildfire does?
I think there's a real debate about that in Canada right now. I don't know that I have the most astute read. I think it's a bit of both, probably. It's both a real cautionary tale, and Canadians like to think of themselves as very different from Americans, and our political landscape is being very different. And our political landscape is very different. And yet, that doesn't mean that we aren't without real challenges and a rise in the far right. There does seem to be a polarization, I would say. And certain types of language and policies are being thrown around now that you wouldn't have seen, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I definitely think that some of these factors are at play in Canada, though thankfully not to quite the extent that we're seeing south of the border. We have a really different democratic system at the end of the day, so that's helpful, right? We don't have a two-party system. We have many parties. I think about 5 official federal parties, and so it's really different. But at the same time, you can have vote splitting on the left or the right as well. Often that vote splitting has happened on the left historically. So it's always interesting.
Yeah, interesting year. It is the year of elections around the world. I think there's 60, is it 60 national elections around the world this year?
64 countries, according to Time magazine, which they report is the most voters in history casting ballots in a calendar year in countries that make up a little less than half the global population. So yeah, that's a lot.
And obviously that's really exciting because it could very well be that the parties that we need would be voted in. And yet, for reasons that are sometimes totally bloody beyond me, it doesn't look like we're going to swing that way globally.
Yeah, it's certainly such a kind of existential year of elections, right? And
that's a nice way of putting it.
There's just no two ways about it. And I don't know, for me personally, I think the narwhal just keeps me so busy that I keep my head pretty focused on the things that I can impact and change, which is largely the experience of our team at the narwhal and obviously our coverage in Canada. And so that's what I try to stay focused on while, having some background existential angst as well.
Well, Emma, listen, this has been absolutely delightful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your expertise and for creating the Narwhal. It is a really brilliant outlet of environmental journalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
So Rachel, that was a really great conversation. Your thoughts, your reflections, what do you think?
I love people going against the grain and setting their own thing up, and the community around them rewarding them for doing that really good thing. I just think it's amazing that yet another independent, climate-oriented newsroom that is a startup in an age that we are like digitally saturated in is growing from strength to strength in a time that journalism around the world is seeing layoffs. Like, hats off to them. I absolutely love it. It was such an honor to speak to her in that regard. And it just makes me so happy to see. It gives me hope.
Yeah.
It makes me so happy to see, and it gives me hope.
If you don't mind, actually, I took a look into like how many layoffs occurred in the US last year. And this is going to come around to a positive note, I promise you. But there were around 2,681 journalism jobs cut in the United States in 2023, which is a 48% increase from 2022, according to a report from Challenger Gray and Christmas. But anyway, it was a bleak year for journalism last year. But as you note, these upstart outfits are actually sort of having a moment. And I think that what Emma and her team here have done is quite remarkable and inspiring. And I think it's a further proof, if anyone needs it, that a nonprofit model can be a solid vehicle for journalism, and really impactful journalism at that.
I maybe didn't sort of ask her enough about this during the episode, but it's also, you know, there's no ads, no paywalls. The Narwhal is totally open source, open access, open everything. And they have still made enough money to grow from a team of 2 to 26 in a very short period of time in the grand scheme of things. Like, it's absolutely phenomenal. Because it's something I really, really hate. Did you see that, Mike? Did you see that tweet that went viral? It was a screenshot. They'd put out this article, and the headline was "Democracy Dies in the Darkness," and the subtitle was something around like why all political coverage should be open access in the run up to the election. And the piece was behind a paywall.
I think this was.
Did you see that?
I did. I think this was The Atlantic, actually.
Oh, was it The Atlantic?
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
But yes, I did see that. The piece in question is titled "Democracy Dies Behind Paywalls" and subtitled "The Case for Making Journalism Free, at least during the 2024 election," by Richard Stengel, published by The Atlantic. It is indeed behind a paywall. However, a commenter on Reddit pointed out that the author addresses this in the piece by writing, quote, "I am mindful of the irony of putting this plea behind The Atlantic's own paywall, but that's exactly where the argument should be made. If you're reading this, you've probably paid to support journalism that you think matters in the world. Don't you want it to be available to others too, especially those who would not otherwise get to see it?" Another factor of this is that I wanted to highlight is that subscription models can also still work, though, and there are a number of them out there. People that, you know, subscribe to like a paid newsletter, for instance, although that a lot of that is voluntary. So it's not like a subscriber model isn't valuable, but I think that the banding together of laid off reporters coming together and creating these newsrooms is really inspiring and shows that there's a market for this journalism. There's a demand for it. People want it, and they're willing to pay for it too. And I think that is something that people should recognize and take note of, because I feel like that is, at least for now, that looks like it's the way forward, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I think my personal opinion is, like everything, news has got to become more decentralized. We need to hear a bigger diversity of voices and stories and angles and all of these kinds of things. And so like smaller newsrooms that are not afraid to become experts in their topic as well, which I think journalism kind of struggled with in the 80s and 90s, essentially, and which I think has also really thrown the fuel on the fire of the public not trusting journalists or journalism, because it has been wrong about quite a few things or not asked the right questions at the right moments. So yeah, I would love to see it. I mean, Zoteo has just been launched as well by, I've forgotten his name, Mehdi.
Mehdi Hasan announced he was leaving MSNBC on the final episode of his Sunday program, The Mehdi Hasan Show, citing his desire to pursue other challenges. The network chose to cancel a number of his shows in late 2023. As he told The Washington Post, MSNBC wanted him to remain with the network, and he was in discussions with them about staying, but ultimately decided to part amicably. In addition to launching his own media venture, Zeteo, Hasan is now a columnist for The Guardian.
He's just launched this, what looks like a really, really fantastic newsroom as well. So I hope that it's the future of journalism, to be totally honest with you, like more independent voices speaking truth to power, which our typical newsrooms have kind of failed to do, especially when it comes to climate.
I have to say there's an elephant in the room here. There's Mongabay. Mongabay literally is a nonprofit, independent outlet, and all of our content is open and free to access. So just to emphasize, dear listeners, you're listening to a nonprofit outlet that reports on the environment. So if you weren't aware already, I'm sure many of you already were, but sometimes people don't know we're a nonprofit, and I just want to make sure that you all know that.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about elephants in the room, Planet Critical, the little newsroom that I run, it's not a nonprofit because I am a freelancer. I don't have any of that kind of structure set up. But it is open access, open source, no paywalls, no advertising, and has committed to be so from day one. And that has not gotten in the way of it, growing to being read in 163 countries around the world.
Indeed.
So I think people are really grateful. People are really grateful when you do hard work and you give them information. And if they can, they will choose to support you. That's what I've learned. Community exists, essentially.
And the Narwhal looks like they do some incredible work. And also, as you mentioned, their website design is just beautiful. It's very
stunning.
It's actually enjoyable to go on there and look through the articles. It's really well laid out. It's visually appealing. The journalism is really important and vital. So if you haven't checked it out, there are links in the show notes to go check it out.
No, definitely do. And also for any listeners in Canada, keep an eye, obviously subscribe to them, keep an eye on what they're doing across the board, but really keep an eye on this case against the RCMP, the Mountain Police, because I think that much like they went against the grain and stood up for independent journalists and made a newsroom and a sort of, the proof is in the pudding, that was what people wanted. They are now also standing up for free speech in Canada and the right to report, which is, being threatened around the world, essentially, at this moment in history. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that case develops over the next 5 years, as she said. But I think it's going to be a very important moment as well in history of people standing up for these tools in our democracy that are absolutely fundamental and critical to the health of our societies, which are being attacked, as we speak.
Yeah. Journalism is not a crime, and it's important for people to understand that, especially law enforcement, especially governments. They should absolutely understand what journalists do and why their presence is necessary to document things for the public, so the public can know. Otherwise, how do you have transparency? How do you have that information? For sure.
I think if Noam Chomsky was here, he would say, well, none of us were meant to have real information and transparency and all of these things. And with the advent of social media and independent newsrooms, now all of the apparatus is saying, oh, no, actually, we don't want journalists here. We don't want those journalists here. But he's not here. So maybe that's what he would say.
Really quick, though, I think it's really worth talking about the fact that the outlet, the Narwhal, is named after this incredible Arctic whale, this mammal. But there's something I didn't know about the Narwhal, which is that its tusk is actually a tooth. It is literally a tooth.
What?
Yeah, it's a tooth. And it has thousands of nerve receptors on it. Correction, it's actually up to 10 million nerve endings. And it's usually only on males. So something I didn't know about the Narwhal. And scientists are finding out more stuff about how narwhals behave. Their behavior has previously been considered somewhat chaotic. So there's a lot of interesting research being done on them. And actually, our staff writer, Liz Kimbrough did some interesting reporting on this. And I'll link that in the show notes so that you can learn a little bit more about the narwhal if you're interested, listeners. The article is The Mystery of Narwhal Behavior Solved by Chaos Theory by Liz Kimbrough on the 23rd of September, 2022. I highly recommend you check it out. As quoted from the article, researchers have used mathematical models based on chaos theory to analyze the movement of a pod of satellite-tagged narwhals.
Oh, I want to read those pieces. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I had no idea.
It's such a beautiful, I had no idea myself. I just decided to, if we're going to talk about narwhals or the narwhal, we should know a little bit more about the narwhal. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful mammal. I just think it's a great choice to name your news outlet after in Canada.
Yeah, definitely. Great choice to set it up. Great choice to name it. Great choice. Just great choices all around,
Indeed.
I think anyone looking to or thinking about, there are so many independent newsrooms to kind of look at around the world. And so this is just adding on, another phenomenal example of it being feasible, viable, necessary, and a really, really beautiful thing to accomplish. I'm really glad that we had her on the show.
Me too. Thank you, Emma, for joining us. It was a privilege.
Yeah, really. Thank you, Emma.
Well, I think...
All right, Mike, I think that's us.
Yeah, I think that wraps it up. Great conversation.
Thank you. See you next time.
If you want to check out the narwhal, head to thenarwhal.ca or click the link provided in the show notes. If you're interested to learn more about the case against the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, you can also find details in the links provided. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, please do spread the word about the work we're doing here by telling a friend, because word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a non-profit news outlet, so even $1 per month does indeed make a difference, and it helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media, find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.